pretty young. I remember being that age, and I thought that, I'd live forever. And now here
What was
I'm
the average death age back then?
much younger. I mean, I don't know what the average date, it all depends on where you
So
are.
really 35 was not that.
Not that,
That's the
no.
average if you account for infant mortality. That's the reason historically they say, oh, the average age was like 35. That's because so many children died.
Oh, okay.
But if you made it to adulthood, you probably were going to live.
It was like, even in the Bible, in the Old Testament, it's considered, longevity is considered an exception, not the norm. So, when we hear that so-and-so lived 800 years, we wonder how on earth did that happen? Well, there are a couple of things you can use to explain that, but one of them is that it's an exaggeration intended to say he lived a long time. So as compared to most people who died in their 40s, 50s, 60s, something like that, that was considered a long life even. So it all depends on the time frame in which we live. I remember when lived to 75 was considered really old.
We don't want to talk about that.
Now we live into our 80s and we don't think anything of it, So anyway, he had youthful exposure to Christianity. I'm going to mention some more about this at another time. By his 20s, he was skilled in Christian living as a layman. So he was a layman. This is one of the good things about this. Is we can't say, well, I have to be clergy in order to make it, or I have to be a monk or a nun. Nonsense. We just have to do it where we are. And any of us can do. So he was sought to be a Christian ruler. He sought to be a Christian in his rulings. So he even carried his Christianity into his politics. That's called compartmentalization, where we think we can be Christians and have politics or hold political positions that are contrary to our faith. And that's probably all of us in some degree or another. So we have to be really careful when we walk this line. He tended to the needy of his realm. He did not ignore them. And you can say, to use the modern jargon, he walked the walk. That's one of the things we can remember about him. And he forgave even upon his death, or his impending death. I told you this story before, but I had a couple in a parish years ago. This is before I became Orthodox, and both of them had been abused as children, a woman and a man. And he always said he was filled with loathing, self-loathing and loathing for the people who abused him. And he said, I will forgive, but I will never forget. Well, that's just another way in the spirit of anger of saying, by God, I'm not forgiven if it's the last thing I do. And the woman, on the other hand, prayed for the people who abused her constantly, and it was all she could do. And when you saw her, she radiated a holiness. And I think it was attributed to that. I don't know, maybe not, but might have been other things as well. I'm sure she had a broader life than that, but I never forgot those two examples, because they were in the same parish simultaneously, and they were such a contrast, one to the other. So St. Wenceslas was like that. St. Lawrence, deacon and martyr, who died in 258. His feast is on the 10th of August, and this is one of the few deacons who are remembered with an octave. There's a simple octave commemorating him. So we don't have his early history. He was born at an unknown date in the 3rd century. He became a Christian and eventually ordained a deacon. Now, in Rome at this time, they still only had 7 deacons, and the head deacon was called the archdeacon, and Lawrence was the archdeacon. He was in charge of all the deacons. Nowadays, an archdeacon is a different assignment in Orthodoxy, but still, at that time, he was the head of the diaconate group. In 257, the Emperor Valerian issued an edict calling for the eradication of Christian leadership. The Bishop of Rome, Sixtus, was immediately martyred. And if you go online and look at Program Sixtus, and I don't remember which one he was, there were several in the early centuries. He was sitting on his wooden throne in the church holding a service, and the Romans marched in and decapitated him on the spot. And Rome still has the wooden, so they claim, the wooden throne on which he sat with the bloodstains on it. So that's what they claim. I don't know. In any case, Lawrence was present when that happened. So he was arrested, and the officials, knowing his position, demanded of him to bring the treasures of the church. For centuries, people, unlike in the early centuries, unlike today perhaps, the churches were not repositories of great wealth. They were very poor. In fact, there was a whole heretical group in the first century known as the poor, who were a derivative of Christianity, the Ebionites, the poor, because Christianity had a reputation among their own of being poor people and taking care of the poor and the needy. So the Romans at this time, even at this time, thought that the Christians held all this repository of wealth. So they told Lawrence that he had 3 days to collect the wealth of the church and bring it to the Roman officials. So he went out and spent the 3 days gathering up all the poor that the church helped and the needy. And he brought them to the Roman authority and he said, "Here is the wealth of the church." Now, was he being sarcastic? I don't know. He might have been truthful for all we know. But the fact of the matter is the Roman authorities understood him to be sarcastic. So and I think perhaps knowing the rest of the story, he probably was. So in any case, the emperor ordered that a grate be made. And so when you see icons of St. Lawrence, he's often standing there holding a grate up, like a cooker, a thing where you cook something. And he's holding it next to him. In any case, the prefect ordered that a grate be made and that Lawrence be slow roasted to death. So it is said that while he was roasting, one time he turned to the Romans and he said, "Let my body be turned, this side is broiled enough." There's another part of the story I didn't add in the bio, but it said that the Romans in the early centuries believed that Christians were guilty of cannibalism because we said we eat the flesh of Christ and we drink his blood. Then understand that, and the doors were closed to non-Orthodox people in those days. We didn't have to open doors to visitors. That's what doorkeepers did. They weeded out the people they didn't recognize. So the Romans didn't have any way of knowing what really went on in the churches. They could only go on rumor, and the rumor was that these people were engaged in cannibalism. So here, as Lawrence is being roasted to death, the last thing he said was, "I'm done now, you can eat." So the sarcasm there, accusing the Romans of cannibalism, is striking. So in any case, prior to his death, he prayed for the conversion of Rome. The year was 258. So he tended to the poor and needy, and he prayed for his persecutors. Those are his examples. And don't follow the examples of the sarcastic saints. I've tried to show you that some of our saints are rough around the edges, and the one I'm about to look at was that way too. And we're all sinners, and we come to Christ rough around the edges. So we want to learn from the mistakes of the saints who are rough around the edges, so that maybe we can avoid some of that. I don't know. Last one is Britius of Tours, and I like to use the old Latin liturgical pronunciation. So if you want to call him Britius or Britius or whatever, you call him whatever you want. You can call any of these people whatever you want. Wenceslas had a Slavic name, and I couldn't even pronounce it, so I didn't even bother to try. In England, he's known as Wenceslas, and so that's what I went with. So you look it up if you're attuned to Slavic language, and you can learn to say the name correctly. And Britius of Tours was bishop and confessor. He died in 444. He was trained from childhood in the faith by St. Martin of Tours. He took a monastic profession. In spite of that profession, he became a passionate, arrogant, and avaricious priest. So that's the way he's described. I like it. And there you go. We've got a saint as the example. We can do what we want. Passionate, arrogant, and avaricious. St. Britius, pray for me. And whenever his spiritual father, Martin, rebuked him, he retaliated with abuse and counter-accusations. By the way, Martin's feast is the 11th of November, and Britius is the 13th of November. So you hear one right after the other if you know their bios. When St. Martin was asked why he didn't depose Britius from the priesthood, he is said to have replied, and I quote, "If Christ bore with Judas, why not Martin with Britius?" For all his rebellion and pride, Britius was at times also very penitent. He would frequently return to Martin with a sorrow as passionate as his rebelliousness had been. In time, through the prayers and charity of St. Martin, he reformed himself. And when Martin died, Bretius was chosen a bishop to replace him. His reputation as a poor priest, however, had not been erased, and he was falsely accused of seducing a nun, the result of which was his expulsion from his diocese. He was able to eventually to disprove the accusations, but instead of going back to his see or demanding to go back, like St. Wilfrid did, he decided to go into exile as a penance. And here I want to explain a penance. Modern American society, particularly the media, has tried to impress upon us the idea that penance is a punishment. So when we see somebody making confession in a movie, and the priest says, say, 5 Our Fathers and 10 Hail Marys, we think, well, what kind of punishment is that? It's not. A penance is a discipline which is intended to start us on the road to recovery. So it's only, and it's usually pretty easy. It's a start. It's a prescription, yes, an easy prescription. So we need to understand that when a penance is imposed. So when we ask for penance from the priest in the Western Rite discipline, we're not saying punish me. We're saying start me on the road to recovery. Well, confession was the first step on the road to recovery, admitting we have a problem. So he went to Rome as penance for his many sins of arrogance and avarice. That's the way he viewed himself. After spending nearly 20 years in banishment and doing that penance, he was ordered back to his see and Tours when his successor died. The people there found him a changed man and soon declared him a living saint. So he was declared a saint before he even died by his people, the same people who had accused him of seducing a nun or believed it. He humbly pastored the church in Tours for 7 years and reposed in the year 444. So he was exposed to Christianity from childhood. He eventually repented of his sins, that many they were. When falsely accused, instead of defending himself, he assumed a penance. And he's proof that God can use anybody. I had a friend one time who I met. He was from a family of guys that caused the police in the city where I dwelt a lot of trouble. They had reputations. And I saw him about 5 years after what I now call my Christian conversion. So he asked me, we were talking, and he asked me about what happened to me, and I was saying what I was telling him about it. And he said to me, and these words are still ringing through my head. He says, "Too late for me." And all I could think about is it's never too late. If anything, and of course, I don't know whether he lived a long, full life or what. So I don't know what his situation is now. I haven't seen him in years, but it's never too late. God can use anybody and anything to impress the world and to change the world. So in any case, what we learned from these 4 people, is that 3 of the 4 had exposure that we know of to Christianity at a young age. This is really important. How many saints have we seen that where they were exposed early? In modern American society, it's popular to say, I'm not going to teach my kids about Christianity because I want them to be able to choose. Well, that's counterproductive because we cannot really choose unless we're fully informed on both sides of an issue. So if we don't teach them about Christianity, we're teaching them about what we do. And what we do if we don't practice Christianity and teach it in the home, we lie around on Sundays and we stay home. It's really sad when we see more. I remember a time when on any given Sunday, you'd pull out of the driveway and half the neighborhood was dressed up in their Sunday finest going to church. Now you're lucky if you see 1 car pull out of the driveway going to church. Often it is we ourselves. That's how we've changed. So what are our kids learning? They're not learning the faith. So all these people were exposed at a young age and they had a choice to make. And let me just say one other thing on that regard. Free will is a very popular part of Orthodox thinking for us. We must exercise our free will to be humans. And therefore, even if we reject Christ, we are doing something human. There's sort of an irony in it. In rejecting Christ, we are exercising our wills, which is what he came to help us do. Perhaps that's why in Revelation, when Jesus is recorded speaking, he said, I'd rather you be cold or hot. If you are lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. The only way not to be truly human is to be indifferent. And yet we've got a society of people who are indifferent. When we don't train them in both to make the choice, we train them in indifference. And then we answer on Judgment Day for that sin. Scary, isn't it? These saints were known for their spiritual boldness, and they were examples to us of that. And they were willing to suffer for the faith. Are we willing to suffer for the faith? You know, are we willing to even pick up our crosses, whatever they are, and try to live them to the fullest of our beings? That's suffering for the faith. They lived by Christian principles, even in the secular realm. They tended to the needy. They practiced forgiveness and prayer for offenders. And what are the words of Christ? Pray for those who do injury to you. And they practiced repentance. Turn around. Wow. We don't do a very good job. And yet what we see is that our lives are filled with examples like that. All these saints we've looked at fit into this category. Now, we're not going to have this class of mine for another few weeks. I have to be somewhere next week. I can't be here. So Father Mark is going to take over this group. And I will do a summary of all these saints that we've looked at for the past year in about the end of the month, I think it is.
27.
Yeah. And then, because we have Holy Week coming up too, which will interrupt things. And after Holy Week, you want to focus on Holy Week, not this class, okay? So focus on Holy Week. That's our cross to bear, so to speak. And that's the way to God. The cross is the way to God. So then I'm going to do a summary of the rule of St. Benedict, because St. Benedict really told us all of this stuff in his rule. And that's why he taught it to the monastics. And then I want to look at some high points from two different saints, Irenaeus of Lyon from the late 2nd century, and Hilary, I think it's Vincent of Lerins, who told us about scripture and tradition. And Irenaeus told us about the word Catholic and the understanding of the faith. It's important that we understand these are the things, all of these saints believed what these two people are going to say to us. They believed it. And that's a part of the picture for them. So anyway, that's where we're going before we finish this year. So thank you.
Father Jim,
Yes, sir.
how do you pronounce the first guy's name again that we talked about today?
Eusebius of Vercelli. I say Vercelli. That's probably the Italian name.
And you said he was from Sardinia, is that right?
He was Sardinia, yeah.
I've spent some time there. It's very
Yeah.
very cool. And did we do Athanasius?
Yeah, we did him early on, yeah.
It's the creed.
Is it in the back of that?
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, I was reading his creed for St. Athanasius. It's very focused on explaining the Trinity.
Yeah.
So, you want to read this, by the way?
No.
So I did have a question.
Because it's a little in detail.
So the word reasonable, like, when we say, like, we offer ourselves to be reasonable, and then, I had a career in sales where I was, like, making deals. If somebody made me an offer, I'd be like, all right, that's reasonable, I'll do it, and so, like, when I first heard the word reasonable in the liturgy, I was like, it struck me as a little peculiar, right? But then I guess also, we talk about the perfect offering.
Reasonable, perfect sacrifice. Yeah.
Right. So, like, how are we to understand the use of reasonable in the liturgy?
I would say Google the word and look at the earliest English pronunciations. So the English often pronounced words once upon a time differently than we do now. And if you can find the parallel to that in Latin, you might check that out. Yes, sir.
That's my question, because I was wondering if that's synonymous with, you see a lot, especially in like Western Catholic, ration.
Yeah.
But that's how they're taking the Latin from the Greek logos, which is like the word, right? It's more like the image of the word, not necessarily, we are rational beings, but other.
It probably is, because in Orthodoxy, the nous, the word nous would translate in Greek mind, and today that means something entirely different to us. But originally it meant the Christian mind. And the mind is transformed when it has experienced Christ. And it sees eternity and the material realm, immaterial and the material. And it understands God from experience, and that's reasonable. A sacrifice which does not take that into account is not being reasonable, it's being irrational.
Another aspect of reasonable that I imagine plays into that, I'd be interested to see what that Old English word says, but, reason and will work together.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If I'm offering myself to God, I've accepted this truth of the invitation. I've accepted this truth that Christ is present with me. My offering myself to Him is of my reason, of my will. There's probably an aspect of will that plays into that. Just as He reasonably wills to come to us to heal it, So there's probably something there that's playing into it.
Could be a linguistic thing, in other words, so
Yeah.
check that out.
Fine.
Check that out. And we have a lot of linguistic issues that we have to translate. And it's,
Like the reasonableness of the sacrifice. I don't know, I always kind of took it to be like acceptable in a way. Because, you hear the stories of like the Old Testament, it's like, with Cain and Abel and God wasn't happy with, with Cain's sacrifice, and that it wasn't, acceptable to him, and that was the cause of it. And so we're offering up our sacrifice to God, and we're asking God to find it to be a reasonable, acceptable sacrifice. And,
yeah, acceptable would be a better word than perfect.
Adequate.
Yes.
You take me a sinner, 'cause
So I just looked it up, this confirms, reason does come through French from Latin ratio, which is the faculty that was endowed into us to give us the ability to be like the Logos.
So it's our ability to reason. It's really from the verb reason, not an adjective, right?
Right.
Yeah,
That's
So-
better thought. There you go.
Yeah,
There
because,
you go.
like going back to like I was saying, like making deals and sales, yeah, reasonable, like you're saying, like acceptable, okay, that's acceptable, yeah, it's good enough, yeah, whatever.
that's
okay,
probably what a lot of
let's move
people
on.
mean today.
That's exactly right. That's what we try to do.
Yeah.
Reason with God.
rationalize.
Another thing too that's underlying that is that the Mass is the representation of Christ's sacrifice, which is the only real, reasonable sacrifice. So we are not, in the Middle Ages, the Western Roman Church liked to say that we are re-sacrificing Christ. Well, no, we're participating in the one action. We're participating in anamnesis, making present that was something happened in the past, and we can only translate it as remembrance. Well, we don't have a word for anamnesis. The Greeks did. The Jews implied it and understood it, but the rest of the European pagans didn't get it, and I don't.
Represent.
Well, yeah.
This represents, like, simply like represent in the sense
Yeah.
that actually is, we're representing, making it present.
Or remember, like we're putting the pieces back together again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
It's
sort of
Interesting enough, the opposite word,
anonymous.
Yeah. The opposite word of that we use in medical terminology all the time. Amnesia.
Yeah.
That which was present is no longer present to me.
Yeah.
That's the opposite of that
Yeah.
word in the Greek that they used in medical technology. So now it is everything that wasn't once here is brought here for me to experience. In the now.
Isn't it kind of like in Greek, if koinonia, participated, remembrance?
Mhm.
Yeah, all the aspects of Orthodoxy tie together. That's one of the things we have to understand in Orthodoxy. Everything ties together. So if something else is ringing out, not working, we need to listen because our definition is not working. And around this, in American society, it's just everything is seen separately. So we have a discipline for everything. Not true in Orthodoxy. It's all together. So anyway.
Was that a top 10 most pedantic question you've ever
Yeah.
Sorry. Just always wondered about it.
Well, here's where language comes in. We're using Old English. We're keeping Old English alive because it's more descriptive many times of our relationship to Christ than is any modern English. And if you want to see modern versions, look in some of the modern prayer books of various denominational groups, how they've worded this. And it's lacking severely.
Old
Severely.
English and Middle English are like two different languages
Yeah.
from modern English. They're actually two different languages from each other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fortunately, we don't spell it the way, most of the cases, we don't spell it quite the way they did like in Old English. I can't even read it half the time. Yeah.
I'd be Bill, I don't know what your problem is.
I'm not very smart. That's it. Oh, well.
You didn't study much Chaucer in school? Chaucer
Yeah,
was
that's been a
another-
long time ago. Anyway, I stay